Robin.
Hi.
It's good to have us with you before your next talk, which will be starting about 7. So this is just a wee stream around, well, maybe you can give us the title of the document. It was just on the screen a moment ago.
Beyond Gers. I forget the subheading, which we went round a few times, but my version had been achieving deficit parity with the UK, but I have a feeling that's not what we ended up with, so there's my memory showing me what I can remember.
Well, I managed to have a wee look over it, but I thought I'd start off with just a wee question of saying, why are the Gers and other official statistics and analysis of our fiscal spending not sufficient to get an overview of what independent Scotland's finances might look like?
Well, the reason for that is fairly straightforward. What Gers says is, if you took Scotland as part of the UK, hacked it off the UK and sent it sailing off into the world unchanged, this is what its fiscal balance would look like. Now, what that says is, a small region of the UK, you know, if that's how it measures, that's how it treats it, a small region of the UK on its own looks like this. What it doesn't do is says, yes, but if you were starting as an independent country, what would the budgets look like then? So what the Gers report does, the way Gers works is basically takes expenditure in Scotland, which is fair enough, that's the money that you can identify the Scottish Parliament spends, and then it says, now here's all the money which isn't spent in Scotland, and we are going to arbitrarily, in some cases there's methodologies to say, this is what your share of UK spending is. And then that's added on and you get a grand total. The problem is that a lot of this is quite vague. So for example, the UK's accountancy, a messy national account and apportion it to different countries, and it doesn't tell us what Scotland would be if Scotland was independent. So there were two real reasons we wanted to do this. By far the biggest is that the deficit question, the Gers question, has become a real Achilles heel for the independence movement. It has allowed opponents to repeatedly say, you can't afford to do it. And that's damaging, and we can't just sit around and take that head on. It's daft to say that Scotland couldn't be an independent country, couldn't afford to be an independent country. And so we have to, if we want to become independent, if we want to get to another INDIREF, we have to take on these kind of comments, these kind of ideas, and challenge them. So that was the driving force. But the reason it's so important is that if we're going to start an independent Scotland, we have to start thinking independently. We've got to stop thinking like a region of Britain and start thinking like an independent country. So what we've tried to do here is to say, right, let's start again. If we were going to budget Scotland not as a region but as a separate country, what are the things that we would do to produce that budget and to get a picture of the numbers? So that's what we tried to do, and I'm fairly happy that we have shown that it is credible to be able to get to a situation where the deficit of an independent Scotland is no higher than the deficit of the UK as a whole.
Right, that's a good overview of the reasoning for it. I managed to look through it today, and I'd be interested just to cover some of it, because there's quite a lot of topics that came up in the referendum that this document tries to address across the broad economic spectrum. So let's just go over some things about the defence spending. Now, I know you didn't, it was Craig, I can't pronounce his second.
Craig Dalzell is the author of the
Craig
paper.
Dalzell was the author, so I don't expect you to have all the data on it. But the first one is like defence spending. So, and there were some numbers regarding about the projection of what part of disambiguating Scotland's costs there are relative to the UK costs in total, and what that might leave us with. I think the phrasing in the document was away from outward projection and nukes. Mm-hmm. So within a spectrum of looking for what infrastructure would be is kind of proposed out of what you're budgeting for in it.
Yeah, well, this is the perfect example of what we mean by moving away from the Gers methodology. Mm-hmm. We are saying, right, let's not try and work out what a Scotland-sized version of a British army looks like, because the British army has a purpose which we very possibly wouldn't want, which is overseas power projection. It's designed to be a big major international aggressor when it wants to be, and if you look at countries like an independent Scotland would be, that's not how they operate. These countries are not designing themselves with aircraft carriers to be able to sail around the world and impose exterior military power over parts of the globe which are nowhere near us. So what we did here was we said, let's have a look at countries which are like Scotland and examine the kind of size of military budget that you would expect those to have to operate as a secure, safe, modern nation. And in every case, we have a low, medium and high estimate in the report, and we've taken the medium estimate as the one which says here we've achieved deficit parity. And in that circumstance, you'd easily say a normal country, even a fairly high defence spending normal country, would spend £1 billion less on defence than is allocated to Scotland and the Gers. So that's £1 billion off our deficit.
And is that with the inclusion of things like upping our input into
NATO
as well?
Well, now this is an important point here. What we've done is this is not a policy report. We're doing another big piece of work, the White Paper Project, which is it's an enormous and excessively ambitious piece of work, but somebody needs to try. At which we're going to say, right, okay, now what would that defence force look like? We are saying here not how would you configure it, how many frigates, how many soldiers. We're saying what would be a sensible sum for an independent country to budget for defence. And that's a reasonable number. That compares to, even if we're a member of NATO, which is spending targets, that compares to a lot of other NATO members in terms of the share of their GDP spend, and other countries of a similar size who are in NATO spend that. Obviously, personally, I don't support joining NATO, but this is to say, this is the kind of scale that other countries like us spend.
Yeah, innately, it's a bit more of an existential question than some of the other more tangible things, if we can use word tangible these days. So the next point, the sort of bullet point on the introduction, was debt and assets. Now I know Craig did a presentation on this before, and the paper's been out for a while, but maybe you could give, just for the purposes of this interview, just give a brief summary of those points.
Well, this is building on a paper that was already produced, which is to say, to my mind, almost everything that was said about the division of debt and assets during the last independence referendum was woefully ill-informed. It was ill-informed by international legal precedent. It was ill-informed by negotiating strategies. I thought it was poor. So what we've said here is, let's have a look at how the international legal precedents and other international precedents to see how this happens. And what we've said is that you can just say, well, I tell you what, we're going to try and take a share of assets irrespective, and we're going to try and take a share of debt irrespective. But that's not how most people do it. That's not how most separated states have done this in the past. What we are saying is that you would produce an asset, have our 9% share of all of them. You start to say, okay, we don't want Trident, so we don't want our share of that. And we probably don't want to have anything like as extensive an embassy network as the UK, so we're not going to take a share of those, a corner of a room in every UK embassy, and so on and so on. And rather what you would say is we would measure the debt that we take on in comparison to the scale of the assets that we effectively buy on our way out. So if you do that, you can have a very aggressive negotiating stance. So it is perfectly reasonable to say that legally it is correct to say that Scotland has no liabilities whatsoever on debt. Now that's probably not a negotiating position that's going to win in itself.
That's the one you refer to as a zero option.
That's a zero option. We can just say cheerio. And again, without going into too much, assets which are in your country are assumed to come with an independent country. So these are not in-country assets. So we're not getting a share of Manchester hospitals, they're not getting a share of our hospitals. So those are taken to not be in it. So these are mobile assets or out-of-country assets. And you can just say, keep your assets, keep your debt. That's a zero option. A maximum option says we take a flat-out share of the UK's debt. Now what we're saying there is, even in that circumstance, even if we took all of the UK's debt, that debt was accrued over many years in which international borrowing rates were much higher than they are now. So what we did was we said, if you assumed a borrowing rate for an independent Scotland, even one twice as high as the current borrowing rate for the UK, if we refinanced that debt, because what we would not do, under no circumstances should Scotland consider agreeing to an annual payment as part of that share of debt. So what we have to do is pay back a lump sum of cash and say, there you go, and we would refinance that. So we would have our own debt as a sovereign nation. Even if you allowed for refinancing that debt at double international lending rates at the moment, it would still save about £0.8 billion simply because interest rates and borrowing is so low just now. And there's a middle way position which says you do a bit of both of these. You take on a reasonable fair share of some of the debt, offset against many of the assets which you're not being given access to. And as I say, fine, we don't get the pound, but that is a massive asset which was built up using our taxpayers' money for hundreds of years. So that's a very big chunk that you would take off the resultant liability, the debt.
There was an important phrase for that, wasn't it? Net historical contribution.
Yeah. Well, what you've got to think about this debt is not the way the Daily Mail presents it, it's some sort of recent failure in public policy. This is debt that goes back, some of this debt goes back, well, a lot of it goes back decades. Some of it goes back more than that. This is years and this is centuries of building up the British state that we have contributed to, and where we don't get the share of the infrastructure that was built up over those centuries, then we shouldn't be paying debt proportionate to that infrastructure. So these are the kinds of things that we're arguing in there. But certainly that'll take you at least £1 billion off the deficit again.
I'm eager just to get through a few points because I know you'll want to have a wee break before your next talk.
I need to get my tea. Okay.
So a big one.
So you're saying go faster? Is this what you're telling me?
Well, what I was saying about the debts and assets is that we've got a video from Craig doing the presentation the other week.
So somebody can go and see more detail.
I can put that in the link below. But a really big one that popped out, which was critical for who we're trying to shift to yes, was pensions.
Yeah.
And a section on that. So maybe you could elaborate on what the paper was bringing to light about pensions.
This is another thing that I think was insufficiently explored during the last referendum. If you are a British citizen who has contributed tax all your life, you are legally entitled to a UK state pension. So the world is filled with expat Brits all over the world who claim the state pension. And that applies to everybody in Scotland. We have paid, if you're a pensioner, people have paid for many, many, many years to keep a pension system in place. And there's not a debate. This is a liability that the UK has towards its citizens. Now, what would happen would probably not be that Scotland would end up having its pensioners' pensions paid for the rest of their life, because it's not year one. They would get these pensions, they'd be eligible for these pensions for the rest of their life. There's a number of ways that you could do it, but we might take, for example, a lump sum of the debt to correspond to the UK's liabilities. But anyway round, there's a substantial financial liability for Scottish pensioners which lies on the UK state. And in the report, we've suggested a number of ways in which you could model how much of that we would take in cash, or in which ways that might take a substantial burden off the UK's annual social security budget.
Grant, well, hopefully we'll get a chance to do some more stuff with Craig or yourself about this, because it's an important
we're
series
also doing a very substantial piece of work on pensions and how they would work, what you would do. So remember,
so this is leading up to a January release for...
Yes, and we won't have all the papers out by then, but remember that the cash to pay for pensions and how you structure and insure pensions are two completely different subjects. So once again, this is about budgeting, not policy, and we're going to come back again and have a look at how you would go about constructing a secure pensions system for Scotland.
Grant, well, I'll let you get a bit of a break before the next talk, but that was great. Thanks a lot for that.
No problem. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
You want me to keep this on?